Picture this. You put students into groups, and one table immediately goes quiet. They're avoiding eye contact, they're not communicating with each other. So what do you do? Welcome to Off Syllabus with Manny, where we talk about the hardest parts of teaching, the ones that do not make it to the syllabus. Today, we are diving into how to navigate conversations across divides. Joining me is Emily Van Duyn. She's an associate professor in the Department of Communication. So with that in mind, let's dive in. So, Emily, I know you do a lot of work around having conversations across divides, especially across political divides. So, what brought you to that field?
Yeah, so in my dissertation or my PhD, I did work on political communication and how people talk about politics or don't talk about politics. And so for my dissertation, I actually observed and interviewed a secret group of progressive women in rural Texas. And they organized this kind of secret political organization because they were kind of afraid that their conservative neighbors and family members and friends would either judge them or, punish them socially, ignore them, have some type of repercussion for knowing their political beliefs. And after the 2016 presidential election in the US, they were really just kind of frustrated with the outcome and really concerned about kind of the future of their state and then of the country. And so they organized this secret group. And so as part of my research, it was when I initially found them to kind of observe what they did, to figure out, why did they feel like they needed to keep their politics to themselves? Like what was so tricky about that? And a lot of that research kind of gave me some answers about why people hide their political beliefs and how they do that. And then as part of kind of my follow-up to that work, I interviewed a bunch of people who are in what I call cross-cutting romantic relationships. So people who have different political beliefs, like Republicans married to Democrats, Democrats married to Republicans. And a lot of that work was like, oh, wow, I experienced really intense political disagreement with with a person that I either live with and trying to build a life with, share a family with. And that's a really intense situation to experience that political disagreement. And so from all of that work, right, I really started to think about like, what might make situations like this better, right? What makes people feel more comfortable or safe talking about politics with others with whom they disagree? And then, how might we create contexts where people can have these important conversations and how disagreement can be used to kind of build connection rather than create division?
Yeah, so I do have a couple questions. Question number one is, so you start working as part of your PhD dissertation. Is this something like, is it a project that you decided that you created, or it was something like the lab or your advisors was already doing and you joined in? And the second question I have to that, which I'm very curious about, is like, as a student, you're joining into this like potentially heated conversations. How is that process of being like, okay, this is your project, or this is what I want to do, and now I'm jumping into this, and I have to learn all these skills to like navigate that?
Yeah, yeah. So this was something my advisor in my PhD did not do any of this work. She's amazing. I love her. She was incredible, but she was very like, doing surveys, experiments to understand how people experience politics, right? And I was kind of connected into the political scene in Texas. I had grown up there. I had been part of working with different political parties. And so I had kind of boots on the ground, if you will, in some different communities. And I had grown up in a rural community. And so I knew lots of people across the state. And so that kind of led me to know the right person who could kind of tip me off to the group. And so no, this was like completely like I happened upon this situation and was like, oh, this seems kind of important to understand, right? And I think
Yes.
it was really like my advisor and other mentors of mine that were like, you should probably like ask them to see if you can observe them and talk to them and see if they'll kind of give you access. And that's something that I kind of negotiated over time with them. But it was tricky because like you said, that going into a situation where there is already very clear disagreement and already really almost like kind of intense fear of retaliation or conflict in reaction to political disagreement in their community. I mean, there was a lot of fear that I could be like a spy or like that I might be
Yeah.
infiltrating them to let other people know, or that I would disclose accidentally to people their beliefs and who they were. And so it was a process of trust building. It was also a process of like humility for me to go in and say, I'm not here to give you the answers. I'm here to learn from you. So the process of research, I mean, I think that's something that's really central to my own approach to research is that research itself can be incredibly a helpful tool to bring people together across lines of difference and also to showcase stories where people are having interactions across lines of difference and doing some of the things that we want democracy to do, right?
Yeah. So, um, question about the context of this. So when you're having these conversations, do you normally have like individual conversations or you have conversations as a group? Like what type of conversations or what type of studies are you conducting?
So in that original study in the secret group in Texas, I did both. I would do interviews with individual members or the leadership of the group. And I also did kind of ethnographic participant observation of the group. So I would watch them having discussions with one another. I would take notes and kind of scribble frantically as I heard them say things. And I did that for over the course of like, oh my gosh, it was 2016 to 2020, so about 4 years. I did
Yeah.
these observations and interviews. And then in the work that I'm doing with the romantic couples, all of that has been either survey work, but also in the conversation work is interviews with individual partners. And like part of me would love to like to actually observe partners having discussions, and maybe that's part of the future work. But in the initial onset, I was worried that like if I was going to talk to one partner, they would not want to talk to me if I was like, yeah, I'm also going to talk to your spouse, right? So I wanted to kind of start with, okay, what's the experience of one partner? But I think in the future it'd be really interesting to observe actual conversations between partners.
I just have to say you have a very unique set of skills, especially very, very important at this point in time with this current climate. So
Yeah.
I want to pick your brain a little. So if you're thinking about like having this type of conversations or facilitating these type of conversations, what type of strategies would you use for maybe like a one-on-one, like me talking to you about this semi-divisive topics, and when maybe I'm having a conversation with a group of people about the same topic. So use the same type of strategies, use different type of strategies, like how do you approach or how do you prepare to engage in those conversations?
Yeah, I think what's interesting is like I'm looking for strategy. Like ultimately, my work is kind of solutions oriented, wanting to figure out how to make conversations better. But also in the research process, right? I have to kind of practice what I preach because oftentimes I am interacting with somebody with whom I politically disagree, right? Like I interviewed many, many, many people from 2016 all the way to 2024 during elections that were really intense, where I'm talking to somebody who fundamentally disagrees with what I think, right? But I'm not there to, judge them. I think the goal of what I'm doing is to try to understand. And like, not every conversation is going to have the same goal, but in particular, research is going to be oriented with the hope. I would at least hope that research would be oriented with the goal to understand. And so when I go into a conversation, not a debate, but a conversation, which is a fundamentally different thing, which is about an exchange of information and to have like a back and forth, right? My goal is to be curious and to kind of lead with that curiosity. So things that have been really helpful to me, for instance, I'm thinking of like times where I'd interviewed people like 2 weeks before the 2024 election, and they are just like super geared up, right? And just like really upset about something, or this is an intense point of view for them. And there's a little bit of a power differential, of course, because I'm a researcher speaking to them, and so and I'm coming from my, quote unquote ivory tower. And a lot of the people that I talk to are just people, in the world who have very little contact with institutions like mine. Right. And so I think there is that kind of power differential. And what can be really helpful when I'm having conversations, especially with people who I know it might be hard to disclose a belief they might think that people in my institution don't support. I've talked to many, many Trump supporters who, in traditional or in the past, have been really hesitant to speak to pollsters or researchers because they feel like they're going to be judged for their opinions. I will often just open with like gratitude, right? I'll be like, I just can't thank you enough for your time. Like, and I truly mean it because like they're a person that's giving their time and openness and vulnerability to me, and they don't have to do that like at all. And so when I start a conversation with someone, I really try and say, like, I'm here to learn from you. I am so grateful for the opportunity to hear your story. I really try and convey that. And then, of course, like good active listening strategies are really helpful, right? Like a lot of times I'll conduct this work just over the phone, but if I'm doing an interview in person, a lot of head nodding. If I'm doing it over the phone, a lot of verbal confirmation, a lot of follow up questions. I always tell my students, like, I think our democracy would be a better place if people learned how to ask better questions rather than learned how to make better points. Because I think question asking is so, so useful. Some of the best interactions I've had with anyone is when they ask me good questions. I always feel listened to, I always feel understood. And so that question asking process and asking follow up questions and showing that you're really listening to somebody is what helps build that trust in kind of these more contentious moments. And that's really worked well for me as I interact with people with whom I politically disagree, but I'm not there to disagree with them. I'm there to understand them. And I'll tell you what, like I walked away from many interviews with people who like I did not agree with anything they said. And I enjoyed every minute of my time with them. Right. Like I think that it's been good for me to have that interaction. And it was a really fruitful conversation.
Yeah, I mean that's the way we grow, right? Like we have to be pushed a little bit, and we have to be able to open ourselves to other positions. Because I think at the end of the day, nobody know what's like, I don't know, like what's right, right? There's always a gray area where like everybody has their own opinion and their own experiences, and that's what really builds the personal experience. And it's important to listen to that. I do like the way you connected all the things you have said about like it's not about making a point, but asking great questions, because that really connects to what you mentioned before about you build trust by leading with curiosity,
Mhm.
which is like that idea that I just want to know more about what you're doing, and recognizing what people are bringing and acknowledging that. So that's a fantastic framework.
Thank you.
So thank you for sharing. I really enjoy this. So I also want to know a little bit about how your work has grown. So I know like you're describing your previous work, interviewing people or surveying people around political opinions, and then that actually grow to more like partner relationships and so on. So how have your work evolve and how have your strategies evolved in this process?
Yeah, I think I like to think of myself as like I like to adapt what I do based on the questions I want to know or I want the questions I want to answer. And those questions are constantly evolving, right? And the research process, much like the process of like learning about other people, is informed by, the differences in people and across time. And so like as I'm doing a lot of the research around the secret group in Texas, it kind of spawned, I spoke to a lot of women that were part of that group who didn't tell their husbands like where they go when they attend the group because their husbands were very different than them and didn't want them to know that they had these political differences. And I was like, wow, that's super crazy. Like to hide that from someone you're so close to, like that is really interesting to me. I wonder how much of that actually happens across the broader population. And so that led to the book that I'm doing now. And now the book that I'm doing now, I'm kind of like, oh, I wonder like how we might solve these things and what solutions look like, right? And so then that's kind of prompting me into my next work. So I'm continually inspired by the stories that I hear to kind of keep unraveling, like both the diagnosing the problem, right? Like I want to know like what is it that makes it so difficult? Because it's not we can't just jump to solutions without knowing actually what is at the root of it. But then also if okay, now I know that this is what makes it difficult, then what could help alleviate that? Like it's an iterative process. And so I just keep kind of iterating on that and that leads me to new directions. And I also am kind of the person that I get bored with the same thing and so I want to do something new. So that's how I kind of continue to kind of develop this over time.
We're still connecting to our core value, I think, in this conversation, which is asking good questions and curiosity. So
Yeah.
you learn, but you learn more, which also brings more gaps that we would like to continue exploring, which is how you lead your research, but also how you lead conversations.
Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
totally. I have this sign literally over on the wall right now that says "Stay curious" because that is like at the root of everything I do, and I want it to be.